Well, thank you. All right, I have one more
Yeah.
question for you guys.
Sure.
That was in the reading today. We didn't really talk about it, but I wonder if you could talk about it a little bit. Knowing that North American racial history is very important to helping understand the current realities of our society. Can you talk a little bit about the period of time, or actually what percentage of American history has been defined either by enslavement or by oppression through Jim Crow?
What period of history?
Yeah, like what
all of
percentage
it.
of our American history, right, has been, well, all of it.
So, I mean, Jim Crow came about after slavery ended. So, like, formally, Jim Crow on like the books starts after slavery ends, and then ends in with the civil rights movement officially. But racism as a whole, it's part and parcel of how this country was founded. So it's part of the history. So it's like we sometimes say racism is as American as apple pie, or racism is in the DNA of this country, because it's just part of how it was founded.
I think one of the metaphor that Fegan used of white racial frame is helpful. He talks about it's in the foundation of the country in terms of how the settlers decided to create America. And so percentage-wise, you're looking at roughly 82% of American history is wrapped up in enslavement and Jim Crow segregation, right? And I want to be clear too, I'm talking about Jim Crow, there are nuances within that impacts not only Black people, but obviously you have the Indigenous Removal Acts, right? So put people on reservations. You have different ways in which Hispanics and Latinx are being racialized. You know, you have different ways in which Chinese have been racialized, right, with regards to the expansion west and what that happened in that particular projects. And so all this stuff is happening all the way up to the Japanese internment camps, right, during World War II. And so it's not just Black folks, it's people who are not white really experiencing the kind of racial discrimination. So 82%. Right. And so if you think about it from that perspective, right, the fact that it's not only the majority, but the vast majority of our history is wrapped up in formal policies of discrimination. And now what we're dealing with are informal policies, right, of discrimination. As I just said, you know, we're talking about redlining and housing discrimination. Now, it used to be legal to do that, right, up through the Civil Rights Act. And now it's illegal, but we still see it happening, as I mentioned earlier, with the context of Wells Fargo and how they had settled a lawsuit where they were found to be using discriminatory lending practices to Black and BIPOC people during the last housing crisis. So these things are still happening on an informal basis, even if they're not actually legal.
Kind of these unspoken policies now, right, that exist.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at hiring. I mean, higher ed is still level.
Yeah, and this is intentional. So what you see after the civil rights is overt racism no longer being acceptable. And that becomes, so what happens then is that racism goes underground. This is what Omi and Wynant talk about in Racial Formation. We didn't read that portion, but racism goes underground, and that's when you start seeing the articulation of these informal policies. So the war on drugs is one of the ways that I think it was Nixon sought to continue oppressing Black communities was through the war on drugs.
Reagan. It was Reagan.
Sorry, thanks.
Even if you go
it was both, right? Nixon and Reagan.
Both,
yeah, I mean, Reagan, he begins it, but Reagan like ramps it up. You know what I'm saying? Like Nixon's the first person to start using overt dog whistles, right? In terms of his politics and policies. But Reagan really ramps it up and uses terms about war on drugs and welfare queen and a lot of racially loaded terms where he's trafficking in racialized stereotypes, right? And so that's where you see these things get in the way it disproportionately impacts and creates Black people or BIPOC folks and creates a space for mass incarceration. And this is where it's really helpful, and why our definition of racism, one of the reasons why I like it, is that it's not just about intention. Intention's part of that, but it's also about outcome, right? And so the outcome of the war on drugs is that it disproportionately and criminalizes BIPOC folks. So we can say this is racist, even though there's no written rule that says you have to arrest more Black people, right? Or they arrest more Latinx folks. The outcome is that you did, therefore we can say this policy is racist because there is no statistical evidence that says Black people or Latinx people abuse drugs at a greater rate than white people. And where there is statistical evidence, what you see is that often white people who are convicted of the same crime would get a lesser sentence, right, than anybody else, than any BIPOC person. So this is where you see the discrimination being most prevalent.